Salam and welcome to another TMV podcast brought to you by the Muslim Vibe. As always, I'm your host Salim. On this week's episode, I'm joined by Rukshana Chowdhury as my co-host. She's the European editor at the Muslim Vibe. You may remember her from an earlier episode, and we're hoping, inshallah, that she's going to be starting to make more regular appearances on the podcast. She's helping to produce certain episodes and bring in guests, and this is an example of one of those. So on the podcast today, we're talking about equality, or I guess inequality, within the kind of education system, looking at things like social mobility, positive discrimination, and I guess what the future holds. And our guest could not be the better person, or could not be a better person, in my opinion, to speak on this topic. Dr Suriyah Bi is an academic. She has a PhD, and is the CEO and report author of the Equality Act Review and the founder of the Journal of British Muslim Studies. Her story is genuinely fascinating. We start off by talking about that and her background and how she got into this whole thing, and the struggles that she's faced from even before entering the working world, but even at university, or before she was getting into university and everything else. She was told by her sixth form advisor that she would never get into uni and there was no point applying, and then ended up going to Oxford University in the UK. She also studied at Yale and Stanford, and obviously has a PhD. It's quite a remarkable story, but there's so much more to it. But beyond her own story, we also talk about generally, as I mentioned, the issues surrounding equality, and specifically the Equality Act in the UK that was brought about in 2010. We do go into a bit more detail about that specifically, but then also more broadly talking about the systematic problems, and how we can address it, and also looking at within Muslim communities, the issues when it comes to access to education, for example, for women specifically, and various other things. It's a fascinating conversation. The time just kind of flew by as we were talking, and I think you'll find it very interesting and very enjoyable. Before we get on with the podcast, the kind of usual announcements. If you are not a subscriber to the podcast, please do hit the subscribe button. It's interesting, we had like a bit of a dip during COVID in terms of numbers early on, but now we're seeing the numbers climb back up again. So please do continue listening, spread the word, tell your friends, tell your family, share the episode on social media, whatever else. Also, I mentioned this quite often on the podcast, and I had a lovely email this week, and I'm in touch with a guy now from Canada, one of our younger listeners. I think he's 16 or 17, who gave some great feedback and some ideas actually for future content. So please do get in touch if you have any thoughts, any feedback, criticism, comments, whatever it might be. It's really important and very helpful for us, and for me as well, to make sure that we're tailoring the content for our audience. So if you do have any thoughts, you can reach out to me on editor@themuslimvibe.com. And finally, if you do enjoy the podcast and you are a regular listener, do consider giving us a 5-star rating on the Apple Podcast Store thing. The other platforms like Spotify, I don't think have a rating system, but on Apple, it's a couple of clicks, and a nice review would also be good. Just a few lines about how great the podcast is and how much you love it would really go a long way. But yeah, without further ado, here is my conversation, or our conversation, with Dr Suriyah Bi. Salam, Dr. Bi.
Walaikum salam. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, no, I was going to say thank you very much for joining us on the podcast. I know you're incredibly busy with the work that you do and lecturing at SOAS and everything else. It really does mean a lot. And obviously, Rukshana as well, it's good to have you back on the podcast after quite some time.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor. So thank you for having me on. I'm really excited.
Not at all. I think the best place to start would actually be with just a bit of background on yourself. And the work that you do, and I guess the sort of origin story of how you got to being involved in this kind of work and why it's so kind of close to your heart. So I'll just hand straight over to you to tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I think growing up in inner city Birmingham and kind of seeing disadvantage and inequality all around me, it was always something that's going to naturally be close to my heart, especially as a young child who has aspirations and dreams, but is always kind of told, well, actually, this is not for you, or this career is not for you, because people like you don't go into these sorts of careers, and just kind of knowing that the expectations around you are not as high, yet that you have high expectations for yourself. So it's always kind of this dichotomy between what you know about yourself and what others believe or have in mind for you, and that there's not exactly an equilibrium there. But also I think having worked really hard and got into Oxford, you believe this idea of meritocracy, you believe this idea of social mobility, and you're like, okay, well, it is true, and you kind of sold this idea. I'm not sure where the idea came from, but you are sold this idea that you're able to the harder you work, the better the more success you'll receive. I think what really hit me, and what was a pivotal moment and will forever be a pivotal moment for me in my life, was having graduated from Oxford, having completed my master's and just been on the cusp of starting my PhD. I was in a job at a school in Birmingham, and I raised a concern. And by the way, that job I had was to fund my PhD studies. I wasn't one of the few, one of the lucky 5% of students who received a scholarship to fully fund my PhD. So I was working to fund myself. And so at this job, I raised a concern that 11-year-old students were being taught, were shown an 18 rated video footage of people jumping to their deaths during the 9/11 attacks. And this 18 rating caution came up for about 12 seconds on the screen, and the students didn't really understand what was going on. They didn't understand whether this was a movie, whether this was real life, because they were 11 at the time, so this had predated. 9/11 was not in their lifetime, it was happened before they were born. And after raising that concern, and it was a legitimate concern, because there's a lot of studies that say if you view suicide in the media, you're more likely to conduct copycat suicides, and 11 to 18-year-old globally, that cohort, are at risk of committing suicide more than anyone else. Or any other age groups. So this was a safeguarding concern, at least the way I perceived it. And when I raised a concern about it, I was told about half an hour after raising the concern that I needed to leave the premises immediately, and pack my bags.
How did you feel when you were told that you'd have to go?
Oh, I was crushed, it was so crushing. I didn't understand what was happening. I knew, when I raised the concern, I was told that I did the right thing, that it would be looked into, that, it shouldn't have been shown, and we'll look at other materials that could have been used to teach the lesson. And that's all really that I'd hoped for, that another kind of source was used to teach the lesson on. It was an English literature lesson teaching a poem by Simon Armitage called Out of the Blue, which doesn't make any reference to 9/11. And so I was really crushed. I didn't understand what was happening. And I appealed the decision. It wasn't upheld. It was denied. And the teacher, the white British teacher who showed
Can I just clarify? When you say it wasn't upheld, you mean that they admitted it was wrongful termination?
No, my appeal,
your appeal wasn't upheld.
My appeal at that stage, with the school directly to appeal my dismissal, was not upheld. It was not successful. They stood by the decision to sack me, and so I was left with very limited options. And I knew what had happened was wrong. I knew that an injustice had occurred, and I knew that at that moment, when something happens and deep down that it's discriminatory, but you have no evidence to prove it. I think a lot of BAME individuals in this country have probably experienced that moment in their lives, where they know something is discriminatory or racist, but they have no proof to prove that. So anyway, I decided that I was going to go to court for this, to fight the injustice. And in my approaching kind of the legal system, which I was very new to, I had no previous knowledge about law, I'd never studied it. I approached solicitors, and the solicitors that I had approached, they were numerous, and they had said that you're not going to get any money from this, maximum a week's wages, there's no point in going to court, just forget about it. And for me, and I remember mentioning quite clearly to one of the solicitors, was it's not about the money, it's about the injustice. At this moment, I'd rather give money to fight the injustice. It's not about the money that I receive. This is wrong what's happened. And I had that conviction in my heart, in my soul, that this was what happened was wrong, and I knew, come what may, I will fight this.
So you anyway, self-represented yourself?
I did, yeah. So I submitted the paperwork to the Employment Appeal Tribunals. I did apply for legal aid, but legal aid was decided to cherry pick parts of my identity, and I actually have a paper which I'll share with you after this recording, that you can see. It's in one of my publications on multiple jeopardy. Is a letter from the legal aid agency, and they say in black and white that while you financially qualify for legal aid, we're not going to give it to you because you're educated, you have a degree from Oxford, you've completed a master's, you're studying a PhD, and you're well qualified to speak, to represent yourself. And my response to them was, and I appealed to them about 3 times, it was rejected on all accounts, that regardless of how educated you are, you should never be required to cross-examine the very people that discriminated against you.
So did you?
And that was the hardest thing.
Do you think social mobility came into that then? Because at one point that you're being told financially you're eligible, but socially you're not eligible because you're classed. Well, that's the impression that they were giving to you.
Yes, absolutely.
Quite educated. So what was the sort of relationship with social mobility then? Yeah,
so it was just a mixed match, really, where things were not aligning. Just because you went to university, it doesn't mean that automatically you're going to be financially stable upon graduation. And it's increasingly the likelihood that that's not the case for a lot of graduates. And it was in my case at the time anyway. And just using the fact that you have X amount of education, so therefore you do not need legal representation. It's not about the finances, it's about whether you deserve legal representation or not. And in this case, I feel it was really it was unfair for them to say you don't need legal representation just because you have come through the education system. I did come through the education system, but it wasn't to do with law. And I think the legal aid agency, with the cutbacks, with the decade of austerity that we've been experiencing under the Conservative government, legal aid has been cut back. And unfortunately, this is one of the impacts that a lot of people are having to represent themselves. Going back to the case, though, as I was saying, that I did represent myself. I submitted the documentation for the case, and that this was back in 2015. And ever since then, this has still been ongoing, and it's been 5 years. In 2017, I did win some accounts. I had a major victory on the unfair dismissal, the whistleblowing element, and the victimization. Unfortunately, the judges, the Employment Tribunal, did not view this to be discrimination, despite there being solid evidence to prove that this was discrimination. But I think, as I was saying, that this was a pivotal moment for me in my life, because I really saw many wavelengths, many bands of inequality experienced simultaneously. So, for example, while I was experiencing discrimination from the school, who dismissed me because I was Muslim, in one of their statements they said that we believed she thought that we were being anti-Muslim. There were documents flying around associating me with the Trojan Horse Affair just because I went to a school that was part of the Trojan Horse Affair before it became a Trojan Horse Affair school. There were emails that were saying things like that. There was emails saying that I'd done my dissertation.
You were being sort of attacked Islamophobic. There was
yes, absolutely. I think Birmingham has been politicized as a city because of many, many events, a lot of which the media is responsible for, and most recently the Trojan Horse Affair. I think because of that, it's been politicized. There's a lot of Islamophobia, at least in perception of Birmingham and its Muslim community. And I think I was victimized because of that, and I was discriminated due to association. And I think throughout this whole process, I became well versed in the Equality Act, and I became really well exposed to the Equality Act 2010, which is a government legal legislation for this country protecting, supposed to be protecting minorities and people with protected characteristics. But what I experienced was that actually the Equality Act, it's not fit for purpose for not only Muslims, but other protected characteristics and communities such as the disabled community and also the homeless community, socioeconomic inequality.
Sorry, before we get into the kind of but by the way, actually, before we speak about the Equality Act, I think the backstory that you just provided is incredibly fascinating. Even when we spoke earlier, before when we were kind of discussing doing this podcast, we had this whole conversation about diversity and equality and the Equality Act and all the work that you do. And then almost right at the end of the call, you started speaking about all of this stuff. And both me and Rukshana afterwards were like, this is unbelievable. Just in terms of like how much you've been through and the fact that you couldn't get legal aid representation, you represented yourself, and you've it seems like, at least for a long time, you've had to persevere on your own. And I guess, I mean, one question I do have is you mentioned what kind of lawyers were saying about getting 1 week's pay, but what was it like with your family and friends and those around you that were maybe sympathetic towards your cause, but obviously weren't in the same struggle directly?
Yeah, I think, the biggest shock for me was this shock that, having experienced so-called social mobility and, gone through the system, especially when you come from Adam Rock and you go to Oxford, and then at Oxford, everyone tells you, you're the bee's knees, you're going to do really well, you're going to have all the job offers in the world lying at your feet. And for many of my peers, that was the case. And I was really well supported at Oxford. I think the level of support that the university gave to me was, it's just, I have not found that anywhere else at any other institution. But coming out on the other side into the real world, as they say, it was a completely different story. And I think the shock of it was that this was not meant to happen. Why has this happened? And as I mentioned in one of my papers, is that no matter how educated you are, at the end of the day, I have experienced only being judged by the 2-yard cloth that I wrap around my head. And that is what defines me. And when people look at me, they don't see the Oxford graduate, they don't see that I've got a PhD, they don't see anything but my headscarf first and foremost. And I think that is inescapable. And so when it comes to diversity and inclusion, we can have all of the diversity and inclusion in the world, but where you cannot get to, where you cannot reach, is the stereotypes that form behind people's eyes, that sit behind people's eyes and guide their sight in the everyday, because that's what it boils down to. And until we can change the stereotypes and the narratives that dictate how people, and dictate the paradigms within which people practice their everyday sight and visibility, unfortunately, I don't think inclusion and diversity and inclusion really has that effect, at least not in my case. I know, sometimes we have to be cautious and nuance things, but in my case, I have experienced this kind of domino effect of discrimination which started in employment and reached to actually experiencing structural inequality from the courts, who were unsympathetic to being a litigant in person. And then universities, because I was a PhD student at UCL, my main source of income for funding my PhD, I'd lost that. And UCL, absolutely. And throughout my 4 years at UCL, I was, writing to them again and again saying, look, could you provide financial assistance so I don't need to work evenings as a medical secretary at the dental hospital or at the university hospitals, Birmingham, just to finance myself or do part-time work and focus fully on my PhD. And unfortunately, I had to have multiple jobs throughout my PhD because University College London, they said in plain, English, they said, we do not believe that your original plan to fund yourself was robust enough. And I said to them, for someone from my background who has never ever, whose vocabulary did not include the word PhD until she was 20, and having come to a PhD, and for all the D&I, the diversity and inclusion, and all the kind of reputational management that universities do, especially UCL, who recently changed some of the building names in light of BLM, I think it's pointless until they actually change the structural policies that are absolutely oppressive and discriminatory to students like myself.
And I think also if we go back slightly towards your time at Oxford. So again, earlier when we spoke, you said something very interesting, which was about how even though you broke that glass ceiling, and at the time I think you said that you bought this narrative of social mobility and it's a level playing field, and there was support to get into university. I guess the difference then is, like you mentioned, you were at university with children or grandchildren of UN representatives who had the networks and the access and the opportunities. Whereas what it feels like, and based on your experience post university as well, is that you had this Oxford educated experience, which is what a lot of our MPs and heads of states have, but then there was kind of no follow-up or no follow-on plan, which I guess is which kind of shows the issue here, right? And for me at least comes into this whole conversation around equality and like we said, social mobility. So I think it's quite interesting and strong that you started off basically by talking about social mobility being a lie that you were fed in your own head, and have now kind of moved in a different direction. And I think that then what I wanted to ask actually when I first interrupted you at some point was with the Equality Act. I think before talking about the issues with it and the unprotected groups that should be protected, I feel like for a layperson like myself, it would be good to get an understanding of what the Equality Act is and how it's relevant, I guess, to your case, but also more broadly, because a lot of people might have maybe heard of it on the news or not heard of it at all. But I think because it's quite central to the work that you do and the conversation we want to have about diversity, inclusion, all of these kinds of things, it would be good to get like a quick overview from yourself if you can.
Yeah, so the Act, the Equality Act was brought about in 2010 to ensure that people who have characteristics such as religion or race are protected, and basically to ensure that we are living in a fair and equal society. But a lot of times with law, it's prescriptive and it's not actually practiced. I think that's one of the things that we're facing. And so it's advised, it's law for employers, particularly, or public sector organizations, individuals who are using the service, especially employees, to follow the Equality Act. And it gives particularly employees certain rights that they know that they're protected within a workplace in particular. And it covers everyone in the UK. And the idea is that anyone who has these protected characteristics, who belongs to or self-identifies within this certain groups or multiple groups, that they are protected from discrimination, harassment, and victimization. And so some of there's 9 protected characteristics. So you're protected by age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion, sex, and there's one more, sexual orientation. I think I've mentioned all of them. I think I have, yeah, I think I have. Sorry if I've missed any out. I'm sure I mentioned 9. So
there's quite an
they're the
irony.
groups.
Sorry, there's quite an irony about missing out one of the protected characteristics on the Equality Act. But yeah, we can move on.
So the idea is that if you belong to one of those groups, or multiple groups, and you're protected under the Equality Act from discrimination, harassment, victimization, and you could bring about a legal case, litigation around if you feel that you've been mistreated or discriminated against. But also, it's a guide for employers, or it's not exactly a guide, but it's law for employers and public sector organisations to ensure that they make the organisation, the employment company, accessible and accommodate on these protected characteristics to ensure that there's fairness and equality within the organisation. No one actually feels left behind or left out.
So you were quite vocal in regards to the recent England's A-level downgrade in August, which had affected students from disadvantaged areas consisting mainly of Black and Asian, and your report also focuses on Muslim students, and you sort of criticised and had warned the Department of Education about that algorithm and have done reports about it. How did you predict and realise that it would have a negative impact, and why do you think that your sort of concerns with other similar organisations were actually ignored effectively?
Okay, so this is a really great question. As we've been discussing the Equality Act review, it's something that I've been doing since 2018, but it was set up through the exposure that I had with the Equality Act review, the Equality Act 2010, through my own experiences of fighting injustice in the employment tribunals. And part of the remit of the organisation is to look at anything or issues that would widen the inequality gap. So as soon as the government announced that exams were going to be cancelled, and that there was going to be an algorithm used to predict student grades, that was alarming from the very outset for me. Especially because I myself was predicted, my sixth form advisor predicted, and not even predicted, he was of the belief that I would never get into university. He said that I would receive 5 rejections from UCAS. And I did not listen to him. And this was in 2010. So it was 10 years before the social and the world global environment, the circumstances that we're currently experiencing. Obviously pre-COVID, and my teacher said to me, "You're not going to get into university." And I didn't listen. I continued to apply. I submitted my UCAS application. Thank God that UCAS allow you some autonomy for students to submit their own UCAS applications without the permission of.
I'm really sorry, but I'm just I'm mind boggled that, like, I mean, on what basis? Because you obviously went to Oxford and then went on to do a master's and a PhD. But how, as in, on what basis did the sixth form advisor tell you that he didn't think, like, were your grades not good enough?
Well, my grades were good enough. I mean, I was getting the straight A's and everything, but I'm not sure. I'm still to this day baffled myself as to why he said that. And so I continued to apply. I got my place at Oxford, and then ended up getting the grades and got in. But my point is that if I listened to him, or if my grades were predicted, as they were for many of the students, well, all of the students this year, then I would never have gone on to study at Oxford, at Yale, at Stanford. And I'm not just mentioning names here, or university, or Ivy League, or, Oxbridge names here. I'm mentioning them because to really underscore, thanks, to underscore the serious loss of opportunity that I would have experienced if my grades predicted, and as a result of that, what students this year will be going through.
So you categorically wouldn't have gotten in
Oh
if the
no.
algorithm.
All right, so
Oh no, not
here's
with this
the,
algorithm. No.
here's the important question from my side: is that
Mm,
when you found out you got into Oxford,
mm.
how did you break the news to this guy, and what was his reaction?
You know what? Honestly, Salim, I wish that social media was, you know, as popular as it is today. Back then, 10 years ago, I mean, we didn't have the Instagrams and the Snapchats. Otherwise, I would have recorded it, and it probably would have gone viral. But I received my letter on the 22nd of December after my interview that I'd got the place, and it was a yellow letter from Magdalen College, and I was absolutely ecstatic that I'd got in. After Christmas holidays, I went in back in January to see my quiz advisor and the team, and I said, "Oh, I've got a belated Christmas present for you." And I handed the letter, and he's like, "Oh, his name's Andy," and Andy said, "Oh, okay, what's this?" And I was like, "Okay, you know, read it, open it." And so the team gathered around him, who was sitting on his desk. I remember it as if it just happened like 5 minutes ago. He opened the letter, and honestly, their jaws just like fell to the floor, and they were absolutely gobsmacked that I had a place at Oxford, despite them telling me that I would never get into university. And I think this lack of expectations, lack of aspiration for Black and ethnic minority students is rife. It's rife in disadvantaged areas like Alum Rock, like parts of East London, especially in the north, in high kind of in areas where there's large Muslim or BAME populations, communities. I think there's a lack of, definitely teachers expect less of those students, and that's what we found in the report as well. So together with my experience and the experience of my colleagues and my peers at the time when we were sitting our A-levels, I knew that this algorithm was going to be, is going to be shambles. Yep. And so at the very outset, I submitted an off-qual kind of evidence form advising them not to use this algorithm, because of, if you're basically going to be using the school's background and their past performances, you are going to marginalize and discriminate against many students because of social background and socio-economic background, because the schools that are more affluent, they'll have more resources, they will be doing better. And historically, that's the case in social mobility studies. And the schools that don't have as many resources, they have lower performances. So it's unfair to penalize students based on their school performances, and that should be discrimination under social economic background. But we'll get to that, because socio-economic background is not a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. That's one of the things we're fighting for, but we'll discuss that shortly.
You mentioned about the exam regulator, Ofqual,
yeah.
And they actually published a detailed analysis saying that they kind of actually admitted that pupils in disadvantaged areas were in fact marked down, and they're in the analysis, and I quote this, they said there's some evidence to suggest that pupils' characteristics can influence teacher assessments. Can you elaborate from your own report, which you've done, what do they mean by pupils' characteristics? What are the other things that sort of students are kind of up against?
Yeah, so this is the thing. We found a lot of other factors that lead to or result to lower teacher predicted grades. And these include teacher unconscious bias, Islamophobia, even though we found 4.6% of students said that Islamophobia was going to be a factor, it was still significant in the cohort, in the sample size. We also found bad behavior to be one of them. And bad behavior is something that is reoccurring from our previous report in June and our upcoming report, which will be out in a few weeks, exploring the post results experiences of students, post receiving results. And a lot of the students, probably around 40 to 50%, are saying that their bad behavior has influenced teachers reducing their grades or marking them down. And these are the things that we were telling the Department of Education and Ofqual, we were advising them to ensure that teachers were receiving unconscious bias training, to streamline the the appeal process. There was no heed from them, actually. There was no success in actually getting through to them. I think it was a very gated process. It was a very gated consultation experience, especially that we, as from the Equality Act Review, experienced. But one of the things that we said very clearly to them was that if this was to go forward, and they did go forward with their plans of the algorithm, that many students will lose out on their future, and hence the title of the report is Predicting Futures. We cannot predict futures. If we are predicting futures, there's no way a grade prediction can capture student talents, student potential, student, a lot of these students were sitting, their grades that were being predicted on mock exams that took place in December 2019 or October 2019, and students said that they'd actually revised so much since then, since autumn last year to the summer 2020, and a grade prediction cannot capture that potential, the progress. Many students, actually more than 50% of students, highlighted that learning style was a significant inhibitor, an obstacle for their grade predictions, because as I'm sure all of us are familiar with, many students will revise quite last minute, so the cramming revision. That doesn't mean that they're stupid. That doesn't mean that they're not capable.
We know about
I think
lifestyle.
I think we've all done that. We have all crammed revision at some point in our lives. I've done that. That doesn't mean that my progress that I made last year, I'm not at the same position. And if my performance at the moment is going to be graded on what I did last September, it's not a great prediction.
So the thing is, I don't
falls
wanna,
flat on its face, really.
I don't want to get dragged into a deep, in-depth conversation about the specifics of exams, because personally, just my own personal opinion is that I think the exam system is flawed, in that I remember failing one AS level exam. It was an economics exam, and I was, my teacher was shocked, and so was I. So we got the paper, you can pay to get it back, and then we went through it together, and basically I'd answered all the questions correctly, but just not in the format that, so I knew the answers basically, but I didn't write it down in the way that they wanted it written down. I feel like there's a very specific method, especially at like GCSE and A level, where it is very much tick box, whereas I think university becomes a bit more about substance and whatever else, but there are certain things that you have to do to get the higher grades, and it's about learning to pass rather than actually knowing your stuff, right? But
it's deeper.
Okay, go on.
It's deeper. When they say that English proficiency or lack of proficiency, one of the forthcoming articles that I'm working on is titled Locked Out of Language and Law. So we as BAME students have, we've been talking post-BLM and even pre-BLM, especially D&I, diversity and inclusion. We talk about white spaces. You don't necessarily have to have white people to be in a white space. Unfortunately, we are governed by white spaces. They're all around us. And one of the things that they're around us in, and we are penalized for, is not knowing language. And when I say not knowing language, we all know English, but it's about how to use the English and how English is, and this is something I've come up against again and again and again in my employment tribunals, is that you need to use language in a certain way because the judges will not accept it in any other format. And as someone who is not a legal professional, I don't have the Queen's English. It's not even about the Queen's English, it's about presenting yourself in a certain way, and a lot of that comes through language. I'll give you one example. I know I've cut you off, Salim, but it's really potent, because it comes back to this, you didn't write it down in the way that it was an acceptable way. You knew all the answers, but you didn't write it down. And I think this is something that we need to look into. And my article looks into this, Locked Out of the Language and the Law. So recently, I was doing an application, and one of the questions was, could you outline how your policies or how your work is radical? And I refused to answer that question. I wrote in the box, I said, I don't like the term radical here, because this is a white space. You may be, there might be brown people or BAME people on the panel, but by using the word radical, you are locking me out of the language and law, because as a Muslim woman, if I was to use the word radical, that would come up in a very different connotations, because radicalization, the language has been colonized to mean something, right? And now when that language is being appropriated in a completely different way by in an application, it's re-entering our language, our discourse, but in a completely different way. It's still only available to a certain class of people to be able to use words such as radical. That's still not available to me. If I use the word radical and people saw me with a hijab and using the word radical, it would mean something different. And so the types of words that are available to us, the types of vocabulary that's available to us, it is down to that. That's a level of precision that we need to look at. And I really realize this in Oxford, and again, as I said, in the employment tribunals, it's about, you have to learn the language of the system. It's not only being present in the system or having a seat at the table and representation, and this idea, what I mentioned before, the stereotypes that guide the way that the site is practiced by people. It's not only about that, but it's also about language. There's a wonderful article by Benjamin Wolfe in 1954 that's published, titled "Language is Reality." And it's true. And going back to your point about, you knew all the answers, but you didn't write it in the way that they found acceptable or they deemed to be worthy of a grade, And so it's about that packaging. It needs to be packaged properly. And a lot of people are currently focused on what the visibility is, which is rightfully so. But we also need to look at the language and how, as BAME people, we are locked out of the language a lot of the times. And it's also similar, sorry, to use another example, only on Thursday last week, I was having as academic, so I was interviewing for a lectureship, and I was told, I haven't made this public, by the way, so you're the first people outside of my family and friends who know this.
I love an exclusive on the TMB podcast.
Yeah, no, this is completely exclusive. I was told, by the way, that my research is explosive. And I'm still scratching my head, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, so if I'm researching on men's mental health, Muslim men's social mobility, Muslim women, and empowerment and feminism from the Muslim women's perspective, and social mobility studies and race and ethnicity studies, how on earth is that explosive? And the question that followed up was, have you received any pushback? And if so, how did you deal with it? And I didn't receive the job in the end. I was considered to be too radical, and my research to be too explosive, not to fit in with this particular university. I won't give its name, but it shows.
We're happy to hear the name if you want to share it. We don't mind.
I don't want to. I think
fine,
I don't want to experience any pushback or anything.
Any more pushback?
Yeah, or any more. Yeah, exactly. But the story remains is that people like myself who are researching these pertinent issues, we're being labelled as. Our research is being labelled as explosive, and again, how on earth? I would never even think of using the word radical or explosive, because I've been conditioned in a way that those words mean something. They mean something in a particular framework, and that's terrorism and extremism. So I would never use them as a Muslim woman wearing a hijab. I would never say explosive or radical to describe something.
Those two words that obviously are sort of bone of contention because of the reasons you explained. Did you give that feedback to the university?
I didn't. No, I didn't.
Do you think maybe upon reflection, you've spoken about it now?
I should. I just feel that if I did,
See, I would.
Sorry. It's really interesting actually this point, because you spoke about when the application that you were filling out used the word radical. It was a term that had been colonized and repurposed and whatever else. Do you not think you're fitting into that, or you're conforming with that mindset?
It was such an irony.
Do you know what I mean? But by your decision to not use those words, Like, I feel like as I get what you're saying, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not going to say explosive on a plane as a bearded man, but being able to use language and not restrict ourselves because of perceptions of others. Do you not think you're kind of conforming to that whole colonized minds type mentality?
So the point, the interesting thing is I didn't even realize I was doing it until I reflected on it as an academic. I was thinking, well, why wouldn't I use it? And that's when I realized that actually it's as deep as being locked out of the language. You know, on the other point about you know, mentioning to the university, you know, the irony is that they asked me to talk about what decolonize it, how my studies, how my research, how my academic work contributes to decolonization of the subject of the university. And I had so many examples to give them about how I'm decolonizing the university. And I have a theory of decolonization. It's called the cycle of decolonization. And I'm writing a paper on it. And, you know, I told them all about that. And, you know, they loved that part. They loved the part about bridging research, academic research to policy and everything. But what they didn't like, and this is something that comes up time and time again, it is the idea that Muslim men cannot be vulnerable. And so my PhD research focused on experiences of Muslim men from South Asia to the UK, particularly migrant husbands. And I found, amongst many other things, domestic violence that had happened, that they were subjected to, as well as precarious working conditions, a rise in mental health, etc., etc. And so there was a lot of research on Muslim women, but there's not enough on Muslim men. And this is something, an active line of inquiry that I'm contributing to through my work. I've got a report coming up on the work and career development of Muslim men, which is due out in 2021. And so I actually was not funded for this PhD research. And I say openly, I've said in my lectures, I've said in this interview that I also mentioned in the lecture that I was supposed to give as part of the interview, I mentioned that if my research was looking at South Asian migrant men who were coming to the UK and engaging in radicalization or extremism, I would have had money chucked at me left, right, and center. However, because I'm looking at something that is the opposite, not conforming to the narrative of the state, of institutions, of the Western eye, the gaze towards the East, my research and I was pushed to the margins. There were times where I was going to leave and I was going to give up my PhD because I just didn't have the money for it. But I continued, and because I felt it was so important to get this narrative out in the open, that Muslim men can also be vulnerable. They're not always these powerful patriarchs and oppressors that the world makes them out to be, and we need that nuance.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, Rukshana, just quickly. It feels like you've alluded to the fact that within the academic sphere, through funding, there is a skew towards a particular prevalent narrative. And
I've argued that. I've argued that. But I mean, in my lectures.
So
there is
I understand that's your perspective, and it's very interesting because I've personally kind of always felt that a little bit, because I've seen how organizations and institutes are set up, and think tanks and whatever else, and there is an agenda whether they say it or not, and they get that out through academic research and papers, and you know they give prominence to an argument. But what's the feeling amongst other academics in the field? Do people feel the same way, or is it just, are you like one voice amongst the sea of people that think everything's fine?
I am, from my experience, I'm one voice at the moment, and it's a lonely journey. And when I mention it, for example, I mentioned it in my interview, as I mentioned last week, I was told that my research and my thinking was explosive. But it's absolutely true. Like, if I was researching or had researched migrant Muslim men's engagement with terrorism and extremism, I would have had money chucked at me. I know it. I wouldn't have suffered and experienced the hardship that I did as a PhD student. And time and again, I was refused by my university to fund me. And, you know, the irony is that less than a year after completing my PhD, an MP actually employed the research in a briefing that I had with her in the second reading of the domestic abuse bill. Her name's Veera Hobhouse. You can read it you can watch her speech. She's mentioned it in there. She's actually taken my research and, put it to the government. And I'll continue doing that because there needs to be a lot of activism around this. So I think that this explosiveness comes towards, as a Muslim woman, how on earth you're supposed to be oppressed? How on earth can you say that, we as women need to also consider the impact of our policies on Muslim men or men in general? Now, I want to share with you a very pivotal moment in my academic life that really interested me in this line of, helped frame my thinking. It was as an undergraduate, I was shown a documentary where teachers were teaching a group of girls in a classroom in Afghanistan, a village in Afghanistan. They all had uniform on, had desks and pencils, and the teacher was writing the alphabet on the board. And there was a young boy outside. He was wearing rugged clothes, hadn't really washed his face. The documentary is called Afghan Alphabet, by the way. You can probably search it and watch it yourselves. And the documentary focused on this young boy who was sitting outside of the classroom door. The doors were open, obviously it was hot. And he was copying the teacher's alphabet from the board into the sand. And it showed that there's been a lot of development, a lot of empowerment for Muslim women across the world, which is a great thing. But Muslim men are being left behind. And we see this in this country. We don't need to go to developing countries to see this. We see this in this country, from the marriage crisis to the incarceration levels to the housing crises. We need empowerment. We need development. We need strategies for not only Muslim women, but Muslim men too. Until we have that equality in resources for both Muslim men and women, we will not be able to have the socio-economic changes that we so desperately need. And this is something that both government, both universities, both academics, both experts that I speak to just do not seem to understand. So I feel like I am a lone voice in a black hole.
Being a sort of lone voice, obviously there have been points in your life where you've had some support from whether it be family, other academics. Can you talk about if there were any positives or negatives in regards to your expectations from family and other people that you sort of work closely with?
So I will be really candid here. I don't discuss this very often, but I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't come from a family that expected women to have an education. There were very different expectations, and I had to kind of, go against the norm to be where I am today. But through the process, my parents have been supportive, have grown to be more supportive. Unfortunately, being the eldest daughter of 8, having gone to university and moved out was not the done thing. And my parents did get a lot of stick from the community, from our relatives, saying, oh, you don't know, there was a girl here, telling scare stories to my parents, saying, oh, we heard that there was a girl here at university who came for 1 year and she ran away with a boyfriend and she didn't come back, and telling those kind of scare tactics to my parents, who would call me at university
I
and
had the
say,
same, actually. This person must be going around.
Yeah, seriously, honestly, it's crazy, like the amount of the scare tactics there were. But alhamdulillah, I'm blessed. I'm really happy. My parents haven't really prevented me. I mean, I've gone to America twice. I went to Stanford, I went to Yale, and for Yale, I lived there for a year. And alhamdulillah, my parents did not once say, you're going to be on your own. Don't go. I actually went to Jerusalem on my own. My parents didn't even, question it, or just, they kind of just trusted me to get on with it. And so I'm very blessed in that way. And I think my family, as I mentioned earlier, the word PhD wasn't in our vocabulary. And my parents, bless them, they didn't know about Oxford. My interview came through. I had to explain to my dad that, Imran Khan and Benazir Bhutto had gone there, because that was his only reference point. Yeah. And then he was like, oh, really? And then he was like, oh, okay, yeah, no, that's fine. You should go then. And so I had to break it down in different ways for him to understand it. Mm. But now they are really, alhamdulillah, they're really proud. And it's, so was my family, but it's taken a while to get here. And I had to kind of coach them during the process while being on this journey of education myself. And I think it's opened doors for a lot of other people. I do want to talk about people I've worked closely with. And, this is something I mentioned to you when we talked before the podcast, and I think it's really important to state. I have received a lot of support, but something that I see time and again, and it's something that we need to address in our community, especially the Muslim community, is that there's a lack of support by Muslims for Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only myself. I ran a 12-week workshop series for Muslim women this academic year. It was incredibly successful, and Muslim women who attended these workshops from all around the country and even abroad. I mean, we had women from Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Australia, America, Canada. They all said this time and time and again, that fellow Muslim women were not supportive. Mentors were not supportive. They were reaching out, but they were not supportive. And I feel the same thing. I have actually been supported more, and this is going to be really contentious, and I think some people will be really shocked by this, but genuinely speaking, I have been supported, and credit where it's due, I've been supported more by white people than I have by Muslims.
Why do you think that
really
is?
Sad. I'm still working out, I think growing up, oh God, again, I'm just being really transparent here, but I think we've heard this term, or you may have come across it, is that, our own people have PhD syndrome, the pull him down syndrome. It's referred to, and it's really sad, but it does exist. But, in one of my skills workshops, a fellow Muslim participant said to me that I Googled you, and I see that you had two white PhD supervisors. And I said, okay. And she said, well, how do you feel about having two white supervisors as your supervisors for your PhD? And I said, actually, I had 3 white supervisors. You missed one out. My professor at Yale was white as well. And she, alhamdulillah, we sign off our emails as Anthro mom and Anthro daughter, because she's literally my field subject mom, because she has mothered me in so many ways, coached me, mentored me, supported me during the ups and downs. And for a professor at Yale to be so senior and to offer someone like myself who comes from Adam Rock is just incredible. It's something that it's just not heard of. And so I just really want people to be a bit more open to the idea that white people are allies and can be allies, and just not strike people off just because of their skin color in the first instance. In my and I replied very humbly to this participant. I said, one of my PhD, the 2 that she had Googled, one of them is actually a Muslim. She's just not visibly Muslim, and her name doesn't suggest that she's Muslim. But her family are in a refugee camp in Lebanon and Jordan. The second of my PhD supervisors, again, she's white. She was Christian. She passed away 4 days after my PhD viva, my oral exam for my PhD. She was fighting a battle with cancer. And so she passed away. And we never really know what people are going through. And to just kind of say, well, you had 2 white supervisors, what do you think about that? For me, my supervisors, they say, and you can ask any PhD, candidate or someone who's doing a PhD, is that your supervisors go where the supervisor is, not the institution. It's a supervisor who makes you, the supervisors that make you. And I was lucky enough to have 3. And so for me, I found that I was supported even at SOAS, even in my other institutions and my other work. I find that white people are a lot more receptive. I've had Muslim women much senior to myself who have completely cut off communication channels once they have seen me kind of climbing the so-called ladder of success, if you want to say. And I think that's something that we need to stop doing
Why do you think
as Muslims.
insecurity? Maybe they feel like...
I think there's a lack of resources, and when you see someone when you perceive someone to have more resources than yourself, then you're more likely to kind of cut people, like not be supportive. Like even with the skills workshops, they were completely for free. I wasn't receiving any money for them. I was doing them in my own time. I was often working through the night to put together speakers. And if you speak to anyone who was part of those skills workshops, they will tell you the same thing. But when I reached out to Muslim women to retweet these, or to share them, or to send them to share them amongst their networks so we can reach as many people as we can, there was silence. I was often met with silence. And so I do think that there's an issue within the Muslim community that, you know, we're not as supportive as we can be. And, you know, we're not always going to get things right. You know, I'm 28, so many people don't realize that I'm actually 28 years old. They often...
You've done so much.
I usually get that. I usually get that a lot, and people actually think that I'm a lot older, like maybe my late 30s. I'm not. I've just, like, obviously I didn't take a break from my undergrad to my PhD. I just studied straight, like without a break. And so going
forward, obviously you said you were speaking to Muslim women. I myself, you know, I've sort of had similar experiences. You know, sort of people are very vocal on social media about helping one another, but it doesn't always come to fruition. And for me personally, I'm really super passionate about getting young people from diverse backgrounds to pursue, careers in the media. And when you actually do reach out to people and decide to help them, it always comes as a bit of a surprise. They're always kind of, you want to help me? And it kind of works the other way around, that people, they're kind of, you know, they think maybe it's too good to be true, the offer.
So you're actually a unicorn in that sense, because my experience talking to thousands of women who have come through the skills workshops, they've actually said that they reached out to people, they've helped me maybe with, you know, 2 questions, and then they're like, well, I'm busy, or don't you see I've got work to do, and they snap back at them. And, you know, there's loads of things. And I think a lot of people will probably be like, you know, with what I've just said about the support, probably people are probably listening right now and probably thinking, oh, well, no, that's not true, or they just be in denial about it. But I think people will probably be, like, you know, vocal about it on social media, but anyone can type something, but actually to follow it with actions is a completely different story, and no one actually sees the actions. That's a problem. Everyone will see a tweet, but no one really sees what's going on behind the tweet, or whether people are following up on those things. So I think that's really that's something to be wary of. But I just wish there was more support from internally of the community, and I just wish that, you know, fellow Muslims, especially Muslim women, just would give each other a chance and be supportive, rather than just cut someone, you know, while they're just starting out something. And not everyone's going to get something right in the first instance. But I've been in times where I've felt there is completely, you know, I talked about this lone voice. You're a lone voice in academia, you're a lone voice in policy, you're a lone voice, and within the community, it's something for the community, but actually the community is not being as receptive and cutting you down or shutting you down just because, you know, things aren't perfect from the very outset. And I think we're all on a learning curve, and we should extend the empathy, extend the support and the compassion to others that we want for ourselves,
in order to raise the equality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we're not going to do that, you know, we really risk losing the voices that are, you know, working to make that difference.
I'm a little bit conscious of time, because there's a couple of things that I still want to be able to bring up and discuss, because I think I find that your take on things is very refreshing, especially to hear these things from an academic and not from like one of my mates in the shisha cafe talking about social mobility and discrimination and whatever else. But like, you know,
He's got
there's
his own experiences. They're just as valid, I guess.
no, but this has like academic research to back up the thought, right? But there's two things I think that well, three things that I want to talk about. So I'll just list them just so you know the direction we want to go in. So firstly, I guess looking at the expectations from families, and there was one particular stat from one of the reports that you mentioned to us yesterday about young women wanting to be doctors, which I think was very shocking and quite important, because although we don't necessarily know the answers as to why, it's something that as a community we need to think about and understand and I guess improve on. Then I wanted to briefly ask you about positive discrimination and your thoughts on that, and I guess from there is how we also address the inequality and structurally bring about change. And I think also within, you know, internally and then externally, so systematically, but then also within our own mindsets and with our own circles and everything else. So I want to try and do that in the next like 15-20 minutes somehow, which I don't know if we'll get through it, but I don't want to take too much more of your time. But so yeah, I think the first thing is about communities, and I think if you start with that report about young women wanting to be doctors, because that for me was very, very shocking and scary. But yeah, so over to you if you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So I conducted the research for the report. It began in 2018, April 2018. It was done in conjunction with, in partnership with Muslim Women Connect, which is a mentoring organization for young women, young Muslim women. And so the research was conducted over 18 months, and the findings, you know, some of them were extremely shocking. There was, you know, almost 50% experience Islamophobia in the workplace. You know, on average, Muslim women experience more than 3 challenges and obstacles in the workplace. And there were, you know, challenges of networking, lack of networking opportunities, lack of career advice. But, you know, also there was starting findings of a lack of, family expectations, which was almost 30%, and partner expectations as well, that were limiting the experiences of Muslim women. And so there was a number of things that we needed to explore what was happening between the ages of 14 to 22, which we found to be extremely significant, because Muslim women were experiencing, there was a loss of talent and aspirations between the ages of 14 to 22. So when we asked Muslim women what they wanted to be when they were 14, many of them said what they wanted to be, and then what they actually entered at 22. There was a much more diversity of roles at 14, but much more narrowing of roles at 22. And a lot of women had gone into more gendered roles like nursing or teaching or kind of admin work. And so we, in using the methodology that I use, which is reverse engineering, I then recommended certain policy recommendations, made the suggestions that, you know, universities and schools and colleges need to be more accommodating to these wide career trajectories in order to capture and maintain and foster the talent that and the aspiration that Muslim women were having at a young age, to ensure it translates to their adulthood and their kind of career choices that they were making at 16, 18 and 20s. And this was significant. One of the other things that we found was that a lot of while there were a lack of opportunities, the lack of networking opportunities, a lack of career development, career advice, mentoring, etc., that family and partner expectations were also a significant obstacle. Now, this kind of follows on from what I was saying about the lack of support from within the Muslim community, that we need to ensure that as Muslims, we are not stifling the development of our fellow Muslims. And so this is part of my kind of thinking, that we also need to look within and not only look outside of the community say, okay, well, everything's stacked up against us. Yes, there are obstacles, there are things that are stacked up against us in structural discrimination, in organizations, in opportunities, in the structure of education, etc., but we also have issues that are ongoing within our community that we need to also address. So Muslim women were saying as part of this research that their families expected them or wanted them to go into teaching because it was more compatible with future marriage prospects and married life and life with children. And so women were making decisions and factoring in marriage and childbearing, kind of that aspect of life in their career choices 10 or 15 years before they even got married. And so that was significant, and it says a lot about the community. And I think if we are not providing that support for our women to be able to have a marriage, have positive marriage, fruitful marriage life and childbearing experiences, but also limit working and career development experiences, we need to question what's going on in our community. One of the most starking things, the most significant and shocking things that I found was one participant shared with me a letter that she had received kind of from her prospective spouse, dictating what she should and should not be doing upon marriage. And some of the things, I'm just finding it so I can read from this for you. Some of the things included that she shouldn't be in external facing roles. He was happy for her to be a teacher only. He only wanted her to homeschool the children, and things that he also wanted her to cook from fresh fruit and vegetables 7 days a week, nothing frozen. Wow. It was down to this level of detail, and this letter is on page 34 of the report, the Empowered Employment Report. It was just shocking. I mean, it sounded like it was a pre marriage contract from like 1930s or something. Those are probably much more liberal. And this person, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to give names or anything because obviously ethics and research and stuff, but this individual who shared with me this letter, was absolutely devastated, and said that this person was actually someone of the deen, and but yet still the idea of what this man wanted from his wife was, in other words, a slave. If you read what's on page 34 of this report, 34 and 35, and it's far from what is realistic for any human to be doing, in a marriage. And I think we need to address these attitudes.
I was going to say that the one particular thing that you mentioned from the report was about at the age of 14 there were 79 women who wanted to become a doctor, and at age 22, when you asked me and Rukshana how many, we said maybe 10, 15, and the answer was 1. And I think this is the thing that for me, because at that point when we had the sort of pre-podcast conversation, which by the way was a great conversation, which I wish we had also recorded, because there was so much in there as well. But from there we started kind of discussing and delving a little bit more into there are issues which you have spoken about for almost the last hour now, about structural racism and lack of opportunities and everything else, and discrimination, whatever else. But I think there is also something to be said, and we do need to start looking within and taking some accountability, I guess, for the lack of, I guess, conversion from these young girls who want to become doctors into becoming doctors. Because yes, a lot of the time cards are stacked against them, but at the same time, you're an example of somebody who was able to kind of push through all of the barriers put in front of you, despite literally people telling you you're never going to go to university, to now sitting there, you know, listing off some of the best universities in the world as places that you've attended, and now lecturing at university as well. But where do you think, because you mentioned the role of the spouse and partners and whatever else, but where do you think we're going? Are we heading in the right direction? Because I guess the argument I would always put forward is that, you know, right now we live in a time when a lot of South Asians specifically, if we're looking at the prevalent Muslim demographic in the UK, migrated in the 60s and 70s and whatever else. And so our parents' generation were more focused on coming here, getting a job, surviving. And then the next generations have been more free. And so they've also kind of imposed that on their kids. So there's like a very small subsect of jobs that people can get into and industries, because these are the ones that make money, that offer stability. So doctor, dentist, pharmacist, engineer, you know, the usual stuff that you hear in kind of every Asian household. But I feel like, you know, as we grow up and our kids start going off to university, I would like to think at least that the mindset would be different, and that we won't do what our parents did to us, so to speak. I'm blessed. Like, my parents were never like that with me. I went off and did whatever I wanted at university. But a lot of people have that kind of rigid framework they have to conform to. So do you think the future is going to be better naturally, or do you think that this is like a systemic problem within us?
You know, I think this is a great question, by the way. I think the pioneer generations, the older generations in our communities, often get a lot of stick for kind of almost framing, initiating these rigid frameworks where you can only become a lawyer, doctor, and engineer, and that's acceptable. But that's considered in isolation. And I think from a social anthropological perspective, we need to also consider these with other factors like socioeconomic disadvantage. And Muslims in this country are one of the poorest minorities, you know, and who are in not only the poorest minorities, but also in the poorest conditions of social housing as well. There's statistics from a Muslim Council Britain report. And when we currently, with the double recession, we've had a recession in 2008, we've had a recession we're currently going through, one of the worst recessions, worse than 2008 recession. There's going to be social attitudes that are changed. Social attitudes will change, you know, as a result of these recessions. That we don't know this recession, we don't know when we will recover, we don't know how we will recover, we don't know what the economy will look like after recovering. But what we will know is that there will always be a demand for lawyers, doctors, engineers, you know, or people who work with computers and are specialists in that kind of field. And so the current socioeconomic background, the circumstances that we're experiencing will go a long way in shaping attitudes of young people in 10 or 20 years time who enter the university cohorts at that time. And so but what happens is that, it's a generational thing, or it's it normally gets, and it has, what it's done is that this attitude or this kind of thinking has been stuck to, and the pioneer generation of migrants to this country are almost burdened with this blame. And also there's a, not only are they burdened with this blame, but what this burden of blame does, it disillusions us. It completely makes us think that actually this is something of the past, and we do not think what's currently of the future, of the experiences that we're currently, the circumstances we're currently going through. And I think so we need a multifaceted approach. We cannot just say, that's a thing of the past and that's a generational thing, that kind of thinking is archaic, it's gone and it's not happening anymore. Actually, it's going to continue happening simply because of the socioeconomic background, the social and the economic circumstances and the national events that we're currently experiencing.
I'll let you finish point. My apologies.
In terms of women, that you also mentioned, I think this is also really interesting. I think both of these are related, but I'm just going to give you some examples here. I was just pre-COVID, actually. I was just shopping with my mum, and my mum met one of her friends in one of the stores that we were shopping at, and I continued walking on, and my mum stopped to have this conversation with her friend, and she had a daughter with her. And later my mum told me that the daughter that she had with her, she was divorced after 3 days of marriage. And when my mum asked her, so what does she do? Her friend had said, well, I didn't see the point of sending her to college after 16.
What?
And I was so angry. And this is in Birmingham. I'm not saying that all women and all families are like that, but what I'm saying is that it does still happen. That mentality, that way of thinking, that women don't need an education, what are they going to do with it? It's still prevalent in the community. Another example is, this is in London. I was on my way to uni. I was a PhD student at the time, and I was actually sitting on a seat on the Met Line, and there were these group of women, Muslim women, who were saying, well, I can't be bothered to wake up early to go to university. I'm only going because I can get this degree and put it on my marriage CV. And this was only 2 years ago. 3 years ago, sorry. This was 3 years ago. In 2017, I was listening to this conversation, and young Muslim women are graduating towards marriage. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not saying that women shouldn't want to get married. It's part of their feminist and their practice of what empowerment means to them. And sometimes empowerment means marriage and having children. That's part of it, right? However, I think it's got to an extent where it's stifling women's opportunities, and we're going to see the next 10 or 20 years women kind of not being as empowered as we have been in the last 10 or 20 years. And I think the key thing here, and this is not something that people talk about, but I am going to relentlessly talk about it here, and something I feel incredibly strongly about, is the social media influencers. They are the gap, the link to decreased female empowerment that we are going to see in the Muslim community in the next 20 years.
You've literally just started a whole new podcast.
I probably will. That's fine. And I'm happy to come back again to discuss this. But and I bet social media influencers will probably hate me right now. But I get nothing out of saying that I want Muslim women to be successful women. Yes, they can have children. Yes, they can have husbands, and they can have married lives. It's something that I want for myself, and inshallah, it can happen someday. But I feel that we also need an education. There's so many women who do not know that they need to have that the nikah contract is not valid in the UK. You get the same rights as a cohabiting couple as you would in a nikah, and they do not know that they can register, that they should register the marriage to be protected under English law. We need more empowered women, because women are experiencing abusive marriages for multiple reasons and leaving with absolutely nothing. There needs to be education both sides. But what I'm saying is that social media influences are completely derailing empowerment for Muslim women right now. This kind of absolute fixation with makeup and with beauty bloggers and with what clothes you're wearing, to honestly, in lockdown, does anyone even wear clothes? I've been in my night clothes, even my pajamas at home. For meetings, yes, I'll dress up, but I mean, seriously, why we need to question, why is there a fixation on beauty bloggers, on MUAs, and how good I look in these clothes, and what makeup sells. Okay, great, that's part of empowerment. We want to look good.
One thing I want to sort of discuss, you've talked about empowerment, and things like that. Just sort of going back to the topic of other sort of education and equality. So in terms of, what are your thoughts on positive discrimination? Because I see that as, that can be seen for some people, depending on their opportunities, as you know, as something that should be celebrated. What do you think about positive discrimination?
This is a great question. I've thought about it for a long time now. I think it goes back to what I said earlier about the stereotypes that sit behind the frame, you know, how sight is exercised. I think it's needed, at least to kind of get more Black and ethnic minority people within underrepresented industries and fields. I think it's needed. But at the same time, I also want to know that I'm in an organization because of my skills and experience and expertise that I bring, and not just because I'm a brown woman wearing a headscarf. I want to be there because I have something to, you know, it's because of my skills and talents, not just because of my color and my religion. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. Because I've been told similar things about, oh, there's this scheme you might have a good chance of getting into because you're quite eloquent and you're Asian. I've had that said to me several times, and I've said no. When I get picked for something, it will be because on my merit and, you know, whether what I'm skilled in.
I think the argument for positive discrimination is that, you know, we've been talking for over an hour now about how the system is flawed and how there is levels of discrimination throughout our education and careers and whatever else. And so if someone is willing to acknowledge that there is a flaw in the system, and that we need to open doors and give access to people that wouldn't ordinarily get the access, then why not? I mean, you know, for example, funny enough, my first job outside of university was at a book publisher, and it was through a sort of BAME internship scheme. So I was, you know, went through the whole interview process and everything else, but they were picking one or two candidates that were specifically from a BAME background. And obviously you get in on merit, but it's just like a limited pool because they're trying to diversify the industry further, which I think is also part of what we're all trying to say we want to do. And so if the
I think that's good, but I think more kind of, I don't know if it's Suriyah, but for me, I don't know, maybe it's because we're women, so we get a lot of these weird comments, because rather than just saying, oh, you should apply for it because, like you said, it's a scheme intentionally put across, but it's sometimes the tone of way things are said rather than you know, and the kind of wording used, like, you know, you'd have a really good
but I think the question, because the question is, like, you know, we've just been talking about how we inside our communities we need to address our attitudes and whatever else, but I think structurally we want change as well. And for me, I guess the question is, because you can't, I was thinking about it even earlier, you know, you talk about unconscious bias amongst teachers. You can't just correct that overnight. That's like that's a systematic thing that takes almost generations. And even then, I don't know from an academic perspective, but it might not even be achievable. So it's like there are flaws in the system. So how do we address them? And I think that's probably the best place to end and to ask, I guess, the final question to yourself, Dr. B, is that how do you see the way forward in terms of addressing these things at a structural level? So, you know, if tomorrow you're appointed on the Conservative government's sort of advisory council on education, I say God forbid because I hate the Tories, but God forbid, how would you address things? What would you do differently? How would you ensure that there is further, I guess, equality and you know, even for families that are struggling from a perspective of immigration and whatever else, but helping level the playing field for everyone? What would you do differently?
I think everything that we've mentioned, and I can't believe that we've been talking for over an hour, by the way. It doesn't seem like an hour. I think there's an interesting kind of question here. You know, positive discrimination, I think there's a fine line between positive discrimination and, which, by the way, I think is needed. And I think it can be good. Like Rukshana, I feel that the wording should be amended in many places, in many positive discrimination kind of roles or advertisements or vacancies that are put out there, or opportunities, I think it starts much earlier than employment. And this is what the research has guided me in inequality studies that I've been looking at. In all of the studies that I've been looking at, I've used a reverse engineering methodology. So what that means is that I look at a social phenomena that it's happening right now, i.e. the lack of diversity in academia, for instance. Reverse engineer by using a survey, interviews, find out what people are experiencing, and then when they started experiencing these things, and then actually look back and say, okay, well, how can we modify the processes for other young people, like the Muslim women statistics that we were talking about earlier. 79 participants wanted to enter the medical field in secondary school, only one became a doctor. Similarly, 46 participants wanted to become lawyers, only 12 became lawyers. 39 wanted to become journalists and or enter the media profession, and only 7 entered the profession. So what we need to think of is actually what's happening between the ages of 14 to 22, and use that time frame and plug in resources at that time or for that age group, so that Muslim women, BAME candidates, BAME individuals are as skilled as possible. So when they enter the job market, they have the skills to be considered on merit. I think it's did the chicken or the egg come first situation. We need to, yes, at the moment, we need to look at positive discrimination, but more importantly, we need to put in more time and more resources in those formative years in which people become skilled. And so this is one of the things that I do with the skills workshops that I've developed, is that we look at upskilling young people, BAME students, BAME individuals who are at the moment in university or looking for work, on skills like elevator pitch. Many of our young people, young Muslim women who came through, and there were thousands in the workshops, they did not know, many of them did not know or had not heard of an elevator pitch before. And so we need to start questioning, why is there not an equality of, we often, the positive discrimination looks at the equality of opportunity. What I would do differently is level the playing field by also pushing for the equality of experience, because you cannot have the equality of opportunity without the equality of experience. Now, say if a role comes up today, all of us are going for it. One of the things we all put in an application, only say Rukshana, you're the only one who knows about an elevator pitch. Me and Salim had never heard about an elevator pitch, right? You know of it, you've practiced it before, you're skilled in that area. They ask you, do an elevator pitch at the beginning of the interview. Now, you're much more in a better position to get that because of your, I don't know, which school you went to, who you were in contact with, who told you about the elevator pitch. Me and Salim, on the other hand, will need to consider, why is it, or whoever's trying to help us, they will need to consider, why is it that me and Salim did not know about the elevator pitch, and how can we ensure that others like myself and Salim know about the elevator pitch from when we were like 14 or 15, and we're practicing it as we grow up into our adulthood. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think it's that level, it's that quality of experience that we need. It's not only equality of opportunity. That's great, but until we give our young people, BAME individuals and our communities equality of experience, the equality of opportunity will always fall short. You'll never be able to fully master it, because until the missing link, the missing jigsaw piece is the equality of experience.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your words of wisdom and your advice. We'll put some links up on the podcast so everyone can see your reports. So thank you again for your time.
Yeah,
so much,
I just want to echo what Rukshana said. Thank you so much. This is, I mean, as you said earlier, the time has just flown by, but I still feel like we have so much more to discuss.
I'm happy to come on again.
Yeah, I was going to say the influencer point that you mentioned. I'm hoping to get another academic on who's actually doing research on hijabi fashionistas and this whole social media sphere. So maybe the two of you can kind of have that conversation together and have a slight debate on the podcast. So, but no, thank you for sharing so much with us and for the great work that you do. And you know, I think, you know, keep fighting the good fight. It's important that we have people like yourself who are constantly going against the kind of mainstream narratives and trying to really push the boat out, and especially from like an academic perspective, because as I said, it's all well and good, you know, shouting in a shisha cafe about this kind of stuff, but it's when people are getting in there and trying to get in the infrastructure and really make a difference and influence policy that I think, you know, we'll see real change. So yeah, thank you, and inshallah, yeah, we'll do this again soon.
Okay, thank you so much.
So that was the conversation with Dr. B. As I said at the beginning, like the time just kind of flew by, and I think there were so many interesting things to think about when it comes to I think for me actually one of the because I was thinking throughout, like she faced through the stuff about the 9/11 video that was shown to 11-year-olds or kids basically, and it had an 18 rating warning at the beginning, and she took that forward and, you know, faced all the forms of discrimination. She was wrongfully sacked and everything else. I think that's, like, for me, one of those more overt forms of discrimination and I guess inequality and whatever else that people face. But I don't think personally I've necessarily faced that kind of stuff directly, but you get indirect things and comments and things that are said and can be, it depends on how cynical you want to be or how, I guess, naive you want to be, depending on how you look at the world. But I think that it's important, and Dr. B is a great example, I think, of challenging the prevalent narrative at every single step possible, and not just conforming and being quiet because it's easier, but choosing the difficult path of speaking out, of trying to make a change, of trying to make a difference. And I think, like I said near the end, it's important that we have people in kind of every different sphere that they might be in doing what they can. So I think, you know, in academia, that's not something I can influence, but something that she can, and she can keep pushing and keep fighting. But it's important, I think, that resoluteness, if that's a word, but being resolute is really important. The more I say it, the more it sounds like it's not a word, but you guys know what I mean. Like, you know, being strong and not caving ultimately. I mean, you know, she's been fighting the case against her, or the case that she brought up, like, for 5 years now, and she has that determination to get justice. And I think, you know, it's important that the principles need to be upheld, and we can't allow for ultimately the system to win. But at the same time, as we said near the end, I think there's so much that needs to be done within our communities. And again, I can't remember if I mentioned it in our conversation, but I feel like it's every community has its own struggles. And so some of the attitudes and narratives, so talking about women going to university, for example, in my personal community, the mosque that I go to, it's very normal for women to go to university, and that's not to fulfill some sort of marriage CV thing, but it's like, it's a thing. Everyone's educated, everyone, you know, goes through the system ultimately. But I know that there are communities out there that have different mindsets and mentalities, and I think, you know, we were discussing this on our call before the podcast, where I feel personally that if we are to kind of follow things through in an Islamic manner, and not our cultural understanding of Islam, but the true essence of Islam, we know the emphasis that's placed on education for the right reasons. And so naturally everyone would gravitate, I believe anyway, towards doing right by the women in their community, but also the men and everybody else. And it's interesting as well that, you know, she was talking and she briefly touched on it, that you have development programs around the world that focus on women, and rightly so. It's important. They've been held back for generations in some parts of the world, but there is also then this issue, and she's now researching and studying into the effects on migrant men to the UK. And she was talking about the boy that was sat outside the school, who was kind of copying along with what was happening in the classroom for young girls. But there needs to be this kind of elevation, I think, on all sides, and importance that's placed everywhere. But yeah, really, really fascinating conversation. And I think, it really has made me think a lot about, for me at least, about schooling and like, I was blessed, I think, that I had very good teachers, and I had teachers that, encouraged me towards doing things and taking up opportunities that have, I think, at least helped me and shaped who I am today. But you can just as easily be or have a teacher that isn't good to you and doesn't believe in you and see potential in you, and that can hold you back. And when you look at the exam results fiasco that we had in the UK specifically, and the going from the algorithm to then teachers assessing their pupils, it's very problematic, I think, in so many different ways. Going from a system of entirely anonymized, where you don't have the students' names on it, it's just like a student number and invigilators who know nothing about who it is or what school they're coming from or whatever else. I think there's a certain power, I guess, to that system and a parity that we get. So yeah, and as I said, like to hear a lot of this stuff being reinforced from an academic perspective, for me, I think is quite encouraging, because it means that there are people who I guess are on the same wavelength and understand the problems, and I guess also have the data and the research to back it up. That's enough of me rambling, I think. Thank you guys very much for sticking around for this podcast. I did pretty much all the announcements, I guess, at the beginning of the podcast. I guess the final one is that if you do enjoy the podcast and you want to support the Muslim Vibe, the link is in the description, themuslimvibe.com/support. As little as £5 or £10 a month would go such a long way to helping us continue to create fantastic content. And to be fair, on a weekly basis, we're seeing a couple of people take up this opportunity to support us. So thank you guys very much. I really, really appreciate it. But yeah, that is it for another TMV podcast episode. We will be back, inshallah, next week. See you guys soon. Take care.